Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus coming to you live from Washington, D.C. today, and thanks for joining us in our DFARS Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement 2021 series. Last year, we covered the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and decided to move on to defense contracting this year. Like last year, this is a complimentary webinar series. They're held every Wednesday. You'll get the recording, the link to the recording from Hunter Barr from my team later this afternoon. But let's move on to the next slide. I can tell you a little bit more information. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a complimentary webinar series. It's obviously every Wednesday at 12 o'clock today. Obviously, it's Tuesday, so we're just going to kick it off with an introduction to the DFARS. Diana McGraw will be our speaker. You'll hear more about her and from her later in this presentation. And all of our speakers throughout this series, throughout the entire year, are going to be attorneys, consultants, and other folks that have experience in defense contracting. Most of our speakers have been speakers in our webinar series in the past, so we're excited to have them back and sharing great content and really just breaking down the rules and the regulations for selling to Department of Defense. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hunter Barr from my team. He's going to go through and thank our sponsors and give them the recognition that they deserve. He'll then tell you a little bit about Diana, and she will share some great content with you guys, and we're excited to have Diana be a presenter today. So Hunter, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and a special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veterans Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans, and please visit their website for more information. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and more information can be found on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 23,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on the screen. I also wanted to inform you of a new series in 2021. We have launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month, and these will take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. And we have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen and then take your live questions about that topic. So, for example, January will kick off with our panelists covering CMMC this Friday, January 8th. And next month in February, another panelist will cover OTA. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals. And you can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. And sponsorships are available, and you can email hello@jenniferschaus.com for a media kit with pricing details. And please note that there's a discount code, DFARS, for a $15 discount for this series. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Diana McGraw. Welcome, Diana. We are glad to have you here with us today. And I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Hunter. Again, I'm Diana McGraw. I'm an attorney that specializes in government contracts with Fox Rothschild. I'm based out of the Washington, D.C. office, and I am excited to present to you guys a DFARS overview. So, Hunter, if you'll go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be, here's our agenda. Today, we are going to cover a high-level overview of the historical reasons when the DFARS came along with its purpose, how it interplays in with the Federal Acquisition Regulation. We'll talk about what happens when an amendment needs to occur to DFARS and the DFARS structure, how it's organized, and the differences with regards to Department of Defense contracting under the DFARS. Specifically, we'll highlight one of the most significant differences, which relates to cybersecurity requirements and also other transaction authority, OTAs. Next slide. So let's talk about a high-level overview, and what I want to do is take a quick step back and just welcome everybody to the presentation, and just kind of talk through some of the benefits of getting into Department of Defense work. One, I think now is the time for those of you, depending on which industry you are in. It has 2020 was a rough year. And while I'd like to say we have hit the economic low, I don't think that's quite happened for every industry. Specifically for those of you that are in construction, you lag about 18 months behind the economy. And so I think with that in mind, many businesses probably need to diversify, and the government, as we have seen in other economic issues we've had throughout our years, the government has always come up and spent money when the commercial economy has had the inability to. And so now is a great time to learn about doing work with the Department of Defense and having a better understanding of what that work is going to require, what those obligations are, and how is that different from doing work generally in terms for the government, for any of these other federal agencies that are out there that are not Department of Defense. So taking a quick look at the DFARS, we're going to, looking at the high-level overview. The purpose of the Defense Acquisition Regulation System was to, manage the investments of the United States in technologies and programs and product support to achieve national security strategy that's prescribed by the President pursuant to the National Securities Act. So, and additionally, and importantly, is to support the United States Armed Forces. So the primary objective here is to assist Department of Defense acquisitions, to acquire quality supplies and services that satisfy the user's needs, the end user, and provide measurable improvements to mission capability and operational support at a fair and reasonable price. So generally speaking, this does apply to all domestic contracts. However, there is some additional obligations for foreign military sales or North Atlantic Treaty Organization Cooperative, as identified here on the slide, 201.104. So next slide. As we continue with this high-level overview, let's just take a look at the historical background and how, how did the DFARS get to the position where it is? The government has always used contractors to supply goods and services to the armed forces, and this really started during the Revolutionary War. Mobilization efforts during World War I, identified specific challenges that led to reform that was necessary in government contracting and a more formal process for advertising. Fast forwarding to 1948, Congress passed the Armed Services Procurement Act of 1947, which provided a more standardized procurement method for all military departments and required this formal advertising that they learned that the government realized that it needed during World War I. And then in 1984, the Federal Acquisition Regulation was created, and this really standardized all government contracting with uniform rules and requirements. Shortly thereafter, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement followed to provide more specific nuanced pieces to the Federal Acquisition Regulation that's specific for Department of Defense work. Next slide. Here, the Department of Defense maintains and administers the DFARS. DFARS is a supplement to the FAR. For those of you that participated in this very similar series last year that covered the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR is just a set of rules that regulates how the government conducts itself with regards to purchasing goods and services from contractors. These rules are applicable to pretty much all agencies to ensure fair and open competition and to provide provisions applicable to contractors performing government contracts. So the DFARS contains requirements of law, Department of Defense-wide policies, delegations of FAR authorities, and deviations from FAR requirements that have a significant effect on the public. The DFARS should be read in conjunction with with the primary set of rules of the FAR. Next slide. So let's talk about where you can locate these, these regulations. And I have identified here or placed an image to kind of give you an idea. And I don't think this photo does it justice, but it's a very thick book, which identifies all of the regulations of the DFARS. So both the FAR and the DFARS, they're located in Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. The DFARS is Chapter 2, and the DFARS is generally amended on occasion to add or remove provisions or update the policy, depending on law changes, additional acts, and policies that are put in place by the government. Specifically, though, the Department of Defense makes changes to the DFARS by issuing final rules that are published in the Federal Register, and we'll talk about that entire process here in just a second to give you a more thorough understanding of how that works. Additionally, Congress revises the DFARS through an annual National Defense Authorization Act. This gets approved, every year, and it's then before the President for his approval. So next slide. And let me give you kind of a better understanding of how this timeline works for amending and adjusting the DFARS. The Defense Acquisition Regulation Council, which is the acronym, and for those of you that aren't familiar with acronyms, you will get a lot of them doing work with the Department of Defense. It's DARC, D-A-R-C. And they provide recommendations to the Department of Defense for publication of proposed interim and final rules to amend the DFARS. These recommendations are made based on reports provided to the DFARS committee and or the Defense Acquisition Regulation System staff case managers. So let's kind of start at the beginning of the process. So the original process is the committee report drafts an interim rule based on either recommendations that they have received related to current policy. So that process takes approximately 7 weeks. It then goes to the DAR Council for review. It's edited, reviewed, approved to be published. It then goes to the OFPP for review and OIRA for clearance. And once all that has been done, it now goes out to public comment. And the public comment period is approximately 60 days. And once the committee receives and analyzes all of those comments, they prepare a final rule. That final rule goes to DAR Council for review, again to the DAR editor for review and DoD approval, and again through the OFPP for review and clearance, and then finally it's given to the DAR editor for publication. And then we have a final rule that is published in the Federal Register. This entire process takes approximately a year. So change does not happen overnight for the DFARS, and what that means for you is that you should have ample time to make adjustments and to either review how you currently proceed with compliance with these DFARS regulations. And if you need to make adjustments, you have time to make adjustments, or at least to have a better idea of what the expectation is of the final rule once it arrives. So next slide. Now I want to kind of give you guys some real-world examples of some proposed rules that are out there right now. So within the last 90 days, there have been 5 proposed rules that have been published to the Federal Register, And these are rules that are proposed rules to that will amend or adjust the DFARS. And specifically, we have them in SBIRS, which is Small Business Innovation Research Program data rights, commercial item determinations, validation of proprietary and technical data, and authorities for minimizing the use of material contaminating hexavalent chromium, and source restrictions on auxiliary ship components. So if any of these items are important to you or affect your business, now is the time to make comments and to provide the DFARS Council with your suggestions or opinions on how these policies should be adjusted or changed. So just to kind of give you a little bit more background, I'm going to briefly cover each of these 5 that are out there, just to give you an idea about what the rule is and what changes we're expecting. So the Department of Defense, this is with regards to SBIRS, is hosting a public meeting to engage in discussion and obtain views of experts and interested parties in government and the private sector regarding the implementation of the Defense Acquisition Regulations supplement of the data rights portions of the Small Business Innovation Research Program and Small Business Technology Transfer Program policy directives. So this is specifically with regards to data rights, the commercial items determinations. This proposed amendment would further implement a section of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018 that provides that a contract for an item using the FAR Part 12 procedure shall serve as a prior commercial item determination. As far as validation for proprietary and technical data, this relates to the statutory presumption of development exclusively at private expense for commercial items in the procedures governing the validation of asserted restrictions on technical data as required to be implemented as a section of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019. So as you can see, we mentioned that Congress can make adjustments and suggest amendments to be revised in the DFARS, but again, it's not instant. Here we are, we've just covered 2 of the current proposed rules, which could take up to another 6 months to a year to put into place for a final rule, and those were published or originally requested as early as 2018. And we're now heading into 2021, and we're just getting started. So again, just want to emphasize that these revisions are not instant. As far as the last 2, the authorities for minimizing the use of materials containing hexavalent chromium, this is obviously references the revocation of executive orders relating to minimizing the use of these materials. And then finally, the last item that is up currently for public comment relates to, and actually is more of a correction to a clause number for the DFARS section on restriction on acquisition of large and medium speed diesel engines. So with that being said, let's go to the next slide and let's talk about the DFARS structure and organization. It is a very thick book, and so if you were to pick it up and try to read through it, it's important that you have a kind of an understanding of how it's organized so that you can know exactly where to go. The DFARS provides legal requirements for federal contracting. It provides the policies put out by the Department of Defense, any deviations from the FAR that apply specifically to DoD agencies. And just to be clear, our DoD agencies are your Army, Navy, Air Force, and NASA. The DFARS structure mirrors that of the FAR. So if you participated last year on the FAR presentation that covered each of the specific parts of the FAR, you'll be in a good place here for the DFARS because it mirrors that same process. So what would be FAR Part 1 is DFARS Part 201. Same thing for 52. For DFARS, it'd be 252. So hopefully that helps give you some sense of where you are in the DFARS and where you should be looking. So let's take a look at the next slide and let's break down each of the 52 parts of the DFARS to kind of give you a general idea of what's going to come, and to give you a highlight. Jennifer Schaus and her team, they are going to be providing through this series. They will be covering each of the 52 parts of the DFARS over the course of the next year. So, a great opportunity for you to come back and continue to learn about very specific parts of how the Department of Defense expects you to operate on their contracts. So, Sections 201 to 204, this really covers the background, definitions, and administrative parts of the DFARS. 205 to 211, these are your pre-award agency procedures. 212 through 218 covers the different types of contract vehicles that are out there. And 219 to 226, these are all of your socioeconomic programs, such as the small business program, the woman-owned small business, EDWOSB. Also, you have the service-disabled veteran-owned and veteran-owned small business programs, along with the 8A and the small disadvantaged business. So so that will all be covered in 219 to 226. Your general contracting requirements, these are your obligations that are identified, as part of the contracting piece. Those are 227 to 233. They're from 234 to 241. These are your special categories of contracting. And then contract management is 242 to 251. This has to do with how the contracts will be performed. And, unfortunately, some of these contracts have to be terminated, and what that process is like for termination, and what rights you have in that process. And then finally, probably one of the most important sections that you will go to, 252, these are where all the contract clauses are identified that will be incorporated either through reference or in whole text in your contracts. So as you can see, it's very similar to the FAR setup structure. It's practically the same. And if you can find something in one, you should be able to find it in the other. But let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. And, I think at this point, now that we've identified how they're very similar, the DFARS with the FAR, now I want to talk through how are they different? What is so different about doing Department of Defense contracting under the DFARS? And I think here, the DFARS contains different requirements for Department of Defense contractors, due mostly in part to the unique concerns of military agencies, national security and defense, which includes the need for the most up-to-date technology to protect national assets. The Defense Pricing and Contracting is responsible for all pricing, contracting, and procurement policy matters, including e-business. In the Department of Defense, specifically, let me just be clear that the DPC, their policy is to manage the nation's investments in technologies, programs, and product support necessary to support the United States Armed Forces consistent with our national security strategy. And so I provided on this slide a link so that you can go and see the DPC's website, take a look at what their policies are and how they address certain issues. You, as a Department of Defense contractor, have an obligation to adhere to a higher cybersecurity standard. For those of you that have watched the news recently and seen the cyber issues that have come up with SolarWinds, this is a very serious threat, and the Department of Defense has a higher level of requirements for doing work with these agencies. So let's go ahead and I guess we will also, one of the other significant differences with doing work with the Department of Defense is that there is a carve-out exception. And I feel like, it isn't government work if there aren't exceptions to the rule. And so one of the exceptions here is this called Other Transaction Authority, also referred to as OTAs. OTAs are an exception to the application of the DFARS or the rules to provide the government with by the government, I mean the Department of Defense, specifically with flexibility to contract for prototypes and research and development without using the standard procurement requirements. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here in just a moment. But these are the significant differences. And while I would say there is a lot of other changes and nuances of doing work for the Department of Defense, that's what this whole series is about. And over the course of the next year, the different speakers that will get up will break down each of these sections for you into bite-sized pieces to help you better understand what it means and what your obligations are when you decide that you're going to pursue Department of Defense work. And again, I can't stress enough, those obligations and those duties are different. And we're going to walk through an example in more detail as to how those differences, what does that mean? So let's take a look at the next slide. And I think one of the best examples is the difference between the FAR and the DFARS when it comes to cybersecurity. And again, there will be someone who will be walking through not only parts 252, which is where this clause actually lies, but also as the introduction identified, there is a cafe series, and one of the very first topics is cybersecurity. And so you can get a full dose of both of these topics in more detail, through that cafe webinar series, which hopefully you will join, especially since you get a $15 discount after attending this series. So with the DFARS, we're going to look at how these two provisions, just so you can see in real, in text, how they're different and what types of changes you can see between doing work for either GSA or FBOP or any of these other federal agencies, as opposed to doing work with the Department of Defense. So looking at its counterparts, and so the two provisions we're going to look at are FAR 52204-21 and its DFARS counterpart, which is 252-204-7012. And so the FAR, and I'm going to talk about the bottom half of this slide first, the FAR has one provision that requires contractors to secure their internal cybersecurity controls while performing federal contracts. And that basic safeguarding of covered contract information systems requires you, with regards to CUI, which is controlled unclassified information, to protect it. And it doesn't provide additional training. It's pretty basic, and it covers information systems, not information contained on the system. And so this contract clause meaningfully addresses cybersecurity information across all agencies, and it does cover the DoD, but the DoD is going to take it a step further in 252-704-7012. So this, the way I kind of like to look at this is this reflects the actions that any prudent business person really would take. They're pretty basic requirements, and there's no training, penetration testing, cyber incident reporting, or cybersecurity insurance that you have to have. And essentially what you're putting in place is what's going to be for the CMMC level 1. So that's really a very basic, that's what the FAR requires, very entry-level cybersecurity. And then when you get to the DFARS, and so now we're looking at the top half of this slide, the DFARS, on the other hand, they are going to require a much more stringent cybersecurity requirement than the FAR. Specifically, they have produced what's called a Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, the CMMC, and this has 5 levels, and the 5 different levels provide a much more extensive program. So let's go ahead and take a look to the next slide, and we'll cover that program in more detail here in just a second. So again, the FAR 52204-21 requires contractors and subcontractors to meet the 15 most basic safeguarding requirements to protect covered contractor information systems that store, process, or transmit federal contract information that was never intended for public release. Whereas here, the DFARS 7012 is going to implement the NIST 800-171 110 security requirements. So the full-blown, if you went to level 5, it's 110 security requirements, whereas the FAR only requires for you to have the basic 15. So clearly a much more aggressive program that's going to ensure that information and personnel are prepared to handle a cyber incident reporting requirements. And generally, this is going to require that you be able to identify compromised computers, servers, specific data, and end-user accounts, analyze information systems that were part of a cyber attack, analyze other systems that don't contain covered data that may have been accessed as a result of a cyber incident, and the ability to rapidly report cyber incidents within 72 hours. I mean, that's huge. So not only do you have to identify that a threat or an incident has happened, but you have to be able to rapidly report that to the United States government, the Department of Defense, within 72 hours. I mean, that is a very fast turnaround. Additionally, you want to have the ability to discover, isolate, and submit malicious software to the contracting officer. So while this is probably a lot for you to take in, and there'll be an entire session that's going to cover this, I just wanted to give you a real example of how the DFARS differs from the FAR. And if you are traditionally doing work for the government, but you have not dipped your toe in the Department of Defense arena, I just want you to be prepared that it is not the same. And you really need to be cognizant of what those obligation differences are. And this is really at the forefront. Cybersecurity is just one of the biggest issues right now that are facing government contractors. And while this interim rule that was released earlier last year, at the end of September in 2020, it implemented the CMMC requirements. It did do a 5-year phased rollout, but I highly encourage you, if you are bidding work now, as of today, you want to be looking through that Department of Defense solicitation and looking to see, does it have 252, 204, 7012? If it does, what level is required? You just want to, and I think the other key here is to know that this requirement, it flows down, it has a mandatory flow down to all of your subcontractors and vendors. Now, granted, the prime may not have the same requirements as, the subcontractors may not have the same requirements as the prime as far as level that they have to meet. This is not something that you can hide, by being a subcontractor and not being the person who's actually in a contract with the Department of Defense. You still will be held to the standard, and regardless if you're a subcontractor or a prime, you should be really reviewing those FAR provisions and slowdowns and DFARS provisions with a fine-tooth comb to make sure you understand how your contract works. So let's take a look at the next slide, and we're going to shift from talking about the cybersecurity to the other major difference between the FAR and the DFARS, and this is what's called the OTA procurement process. And this is the Department of Defense can forego any of the DFARS pre-award full competition requirements in order to carry out prototype projects that are directly relevant to enhancing the mission effectiveness. There is no similar FAR exemption for this type of prototype and R&D research. for civilian agencies. So this is something that you're only going to see with the Department of Defense. And just to kind of give you some background on when OTAs showed up on scene, Congress first authorized them in 1958 with the passage of the National Aeronautics and Space Act. And while it was quite a long time ago, it really hasn't become the useful vehicle until 2015. And so let's kind of talk about what OTAs, what their purpose is, to kind of give you a better idea. So OTAs are a more flexible acquisition approach that enables specific federal agencies to access goods and services outside of the traditional acquisition process. They are not subject to the DFARS, or any other related regulations, meaning that all of the usual government contract requirements that are either absent or negotiable. In return, OTAs give agencies greater flexibility and customization in designing a contract approach that can incentivize and attract non-traditional defense contractors. It better manages risk and uncertainties and increases efficiency. OTAs, though, are not without risk. They can be more complicated to design and execute, which is compounded by the lack of familiarity and training amongst the broader acquisition community. Additionally, OTAs are more restrictive in what they can be used for. The specifics depend on the laws and statutes governing the different Department of Defense agencies and OTA authorities, but OTAs are largely limited to activities involving R&D. So let's take a look at the next slide and talk some more in detail about what these procurements may look like. So generally speaking, these procurements, if they cost in excess of $100,000 but less than $100 million, but are less than $500 million, then you only need written approval of a senior procurement agency executive. But if they are in excess of $500 million, you will need written determination from the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering or the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. These projects are, really what items that are essential for national security, and they are only required to give 30 days notice. Again, these were always intended to be primarily to non-traditional contractors, and you may be asking yourself, well, what's a non-traditional contractor? That's an entity that's not currently performing or has not performed any Department of Defense contract or subcontracts for at least the 1-year period preceding the solicitation. So a lot of these are, maybe they're colleges, they're research facilities, they're cities, quite an array of what a non-traditional contractor is. So let's take a look at how these have developed over the years. So next slide. As I mentioned, OTAs were authorized in 1948. I'm sorry, they were authorized in 1958. I got the wrong year, 1958. But it wasn't until recently that we've really seen the full effect of these. So in 2019, the OTA obligations increased 75%, and have increased almost 712% since fiscal year 2015. So the spending has gone from approximately $0.7 billion to $7.4 billion in 2019. The Army leads the Department of Defense agencies in the number of OTA procurements used. And generally, again, this has to do with research and development, and usually, and I would say usually, but oftentimes deal with weapons and that type of research. So OTA procurements have totaled 18% of all of the Department of Defense contracts in 2019, which has been obviously a huge jump that we've seen over the years, and this is growing and growing to become a more flexible vehicle that Department of Defense agencies are trending towards, especially when it has to do with research and development, or and I think we may even see probably in the near future that Department of Defense will use these OTAs, especially when you get to the final stages of testing weapons to see that they're doing what they were if they're performing the way they were intended to perform. So we may see some of that crossover happen, in 2021 and 2022. I went ahead and I did provide you guys a link where you can take a look at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which really has a great report on how OTAs have come full circle in the last 5 years. And let's go on to the next slide. This takes us really to the end of the presentation, and what I wanted to do here was just take a moment to reflect with you guys. I think one of the, and I wanted to provide some insight into what, I believe the market, the shifts we're going to see in the market. And while the government, and specifically the Department of Defense, is going to increase spending over the next year and 2 years, especially in light of the pandemic and what we've seen happen so far, I just think that spend is going to continue to grow. And like we have seen already, anytime the government throws huge amounts of money into the economy, that money does not come without strings. And the strings, the limits you're going to see is there's going to be a ton of oversight. People will be scrutinizing how agencies are spending this money, and they're going to be scrutinizing government contractors. And are you living up to the expectation? Are you doing what you said you would do? Are you accomplishing the FAR and DFARS requirements that have been set forth in your contracts? And if you aren't, you're putting yourself out there at huge risk. And if you are looking to get into this market and try to build and diversify your portfolio, it is so imperative, I just cannot stress enough, that you should take extra care in reviewing these provisions so that you truly understand what your obligations are, what you're being asked to do. And these provisions are not hidden from you. There is an entire section in the solicitation when you bid work that identifies either in full text or by reference what these requirements are and what you will be held to. So before you even submit your bid, you should be well aware and you are on notice for what the requirements and obligations will be. So I just encourage you to take that extra care. If you have questions, ask. I know that I'm happy to help, and there will be a whole slew of experts and other attorneys who will be presenting through this process that will help shed some light on each part of the DFARS, and will walk you through all 52 parts. And it's a lot of information to take down. But I think it's great to be prepared, diversify if you can, and just if you have questions, make sure you ask. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jennifer and Hunter and their team.
Thank you so much, Diana, for a great presentation and sharing your time with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us and attended the webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And like mentioned earlier, please join us tomorrow for our DFARS Part 201 webinar, and please join us this Friday for our new Q&A Live Cafe series.